Hello, my name is Nicholas Furnival. You are watching or listening to an OSW podcast. Today I'm talking to Marek Menkiszak, OSW's head of the Russian department. We'll be discussing the current situation in Russia and looking towards the future. In the introduction, I promised we'd be looking forwards, but I'm immediately going to break that promise and look backwards to last month, February 2023, because there were two large events, Putin's annual address and the first anniversary of the war that Russia launched against Ukraine. Could you shed some light onto those two events, please?
Well, first, I would like to make some clarification that we do not use the term war in a sense describing the events of the 24th February 2022. We call it a kind of full-scale invasion or kind of radical escalation because, as we know, the war have started in 2014. So I think that's a useful distinction, even if the scale of what happened is enormous. Indeed, Putin's speech has been watched very carefully because there had been some expectations about what he was going to say. I think that was not a surprise to hear the certain basic message from Putin, which consisted of two basic messages addressed towards both audience within Russia and outside Russia. So first message was that we in Russia have to be united, basically meaning around the Kremlin, because we are under attack from abroad, under attack by the West, because what clearly Putin wanted to point out is that, in his view, what is happening is a basic continuation of the long time Western aggression on Russia, with the eventual aim of basically put Russia on its knees to maybe even finally destroy the Russian statehood. So he tries to portray the situation in which he put his country and his compatriots into as actually a defensive war fought by the whole Russia, in which unity of the Russian society and the full loyalty of the Russian society towards the Russian leadership is a key actual factor which will inevitably lead to a victory by Russia, whatever it means.
Okay. Could I stop you? Because I heard you in our previous publication, 1 Year of War, saying that the initial message was that this is not a war for all the Russian people, and now suddenly it is. So is this a very intelligent change from the Kremlin, or is it a forced one?
Yes, it is a forced one, and actually it's still a strange situation in which we have kind of a double message coming. One message is that, well, we still are within the sort of a special operation, special military operation, because it is still officially called that name, even if everybody understands it's a kind of a full-scale war. But still, there is this message to the people, well, our country is strong, our country is really resilient, our people are resilient, so basically you should not worry too much. Because basically it's not unusual to face the kind of aggression we are facing, and we will carry on basically the special military operation until the victorious end, without obviously suggesting when and how this end may come. And the second message is that basically we are facing a kind of paramount aggression, which can be somehow compared to the Great Patriotic War fought by the Soviet Union between the 1941 and 1945, with a clear kind of attempt to raise some emotions. So the Russian propaganda in this message is trying to compare the current events with the so-called Great Patriotic War fought with the Nazi Germany between 1941 and 1945, and to suggest that because we then were united as a country, as a people, we actually succeeded over Nazi Germany, and we somehow can repeat that effort today,
Could I say
facing the West.
The role of Nazi Germany here is fulfilled by the West or NATO.
Yeah, exactly. So, but still, you have this tension between those two messages. So one message is basically, well, nothing special happens. I mean, we have some, of course, difficulties because we're facing all the power of US and NATO, but victory will be ours, and we basically carry on our limited special military operation. And the second message, which is basically different, is that, well, we are facing a major aggression, and as during the Great Patriotic War, we have to unite to eventually prevail in that systemic conflict of enormous scale, which actually at stake of which is the survival of our state. So there is this kind of strange combination of these two types of messages. One is actually supposed to make people calm, that we have things under control. You should not worry too much because actually we are doing our job, and our military does it, and actually it's a matter of time basically that we fulfill the goals of this operation. And second message is actually we need some extraordinary efforts on the part of the whole of the society, all the institutions, actually to get united because of the great scale of the Western threat.
I don't know how you're controlling yourself and not saying doublethink at the moment. So
Yeah.
it's taking an effort.
But it's kind of classics, I would say. I mean, the problem is that, which is sometimes difficult to grasp by the observers, especially Western observers, that there are a lot of paradoxes in both the Russian narrative and the Russian policies, actually combining the things that's supposed to be actually conflicting.
Okay. So we've immediately started looking forward, so you helped me to make that link. But you've told me Russia's goals are quite simple in
If
Ukraine.
I may,
Go ahead.
if I may interrupt you, because there was the second part of the message.
Oh, I beg your pardon.
So one part was basically about the unity. The second message, a threatening message towards the West, was that actually Russia may be prepared to escalate, and actually it is making currently decisions which demonstrate its will and certain areas in which it can strike back against the West. And this sphere is mostly nuclear disarmament.
I've heard about the threats of nuclear escalation.
Yeah.
But what are the other threats made against the West?
Well, actually, the difference is that there was a kind of small action on the Russian part, which was suggestions that it can be substantiated. So the threats could be substantiated by some policy measures. And I mean by that, of course, so-called suspension of the participation of Russia into START 3 or New START agreement with the US, a kind of symbolic gesture which actually sends signal to the US, to the Washington, to Biden administration, that since this administration has been interested actually in continuing the dialogue with Russia and potentially to prolong the START agreement, Russia actually makes this conditional upon the U.S. policies. And the unofficial linkage, because official linkage obviously was made to U.S. policies in respect of its nuclear armament modernization, but an official link actually meant was Ukraine. So the message was basically how it should be understood. Until the U.S. are not ready to limit the military support for Ukraine in that conflict, which actually is absolutely key for Ukraine to sustain the current war effort against Russia, we will actually dismantle all existing elements of the disarmament regime, also including those elements which you deem especially valuable, which actually is strategic nuclear arms. So that was this threatening message which was sent by Putin, actually with an attempt to fuel debate, both
within the U.S.
Both within the U.S. and between the U.S. and European allies within NATO. So basically, the idea was to invigorate those voices belonging to a sort of a peace camp between both the broader security establishment of the U.S., but also within the elites in Western European countries, important NATO member states, about the high price the West could be paying for actually not trying to freeze this conflict as fast as possible. And part of this price actually is basically in the sphere of disarmament, and especially strategic nuclear disarmament, which is deemed quite valuable.
So, and the first steps have been taken to, as you said, substantiate these threats. But what's the reaction? What reaction should we expect, and what reaction has there been already? Has it been successful?
And I mean, at this point, there was not the reaction Russians really hoped for, which was, as I said, a debate, a kind of heated debate about, well, how we possibly should save the START treaty and the whole concept of nuclear disarmament. But on the other hand, obviously there were signals from the administration, mostly from the State Department of the U.S., that it is, well, they believe this Russian move is very unhelpful, and they would like to discuss with the Russians actually about the possibility to change those decisions. However, at least in public, there was no offer of kind of reciprocal moves or any concessions actually to reach that effect, which is a good thing.
Okay, yeah, I was going to ask, what is a good thing from the West? So, Russia is making threats to the collective West. How should the collective West react?
I would maybe add some few elements to this Russian message, because what Putin says is one thing, but what Russia does actually is also kind of additional element. So basically, what we are now facing in Ukraine is a sort of escalation by Russia. So basically, Russia escalates. And it escalates by expanding the quantity of forces used especially on key Donbas front. So the Russian attempt to take city of Bakhmut, which became actually symbolic for both sides. Which is important for Russia actually to have a sign of some appearance of success in this war, but also escalates attacks against critical infrastructure, especially energy infrastructure of Ukraine, with the aim to increase the social sufferings of the population of Ukraine. So adding to this kind of moral dilemma, moral hazard towards the Kiev government, but also suggesting to the West that actually, look, you are under constant necessity to send both financial and technical support for Ukraine. You're talking about the rebuilding Ukraine, recovery of Ukraine. We will make that price very high also to you, actually, and to your policies. So you have to take it into consideration.
So obviously the cost that the Kremlin is willing to bear in increasing this cost for the West is incredibly high, but would it not be the case that as much damage as Russia can inflict, the West can afford to help repair?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And actually, the Russian message, partially, is that Russia's resilience is bigger than yours. That's a kind of key message. Russian.
Would you believe that's the case?
No. I believe that a lot depends on the time factor. Actually, there is a lot of debate about the time factor, which indeed is important here. And there are, it's much more complicated in reality. So on one hand, actually, what Russia seeks is reaching sort of a tipping point. So basically, by all this type of escalation and by all these messages thrown towards the West, to create a psychological political effect. So basically, to create an effect that, look, the costs of prolonging of this war are enormous. So what you really need to focus on is actually attempt to freeze that conflict as fast as possible. And there is obviously only one method to do that. You have to pressure the Kiev government in order to engage into a sort of diplomatic talks and actually accept the informal Russian terms, meaning in that respect, first of all, to acknowledge the status quo changes, territorial status quo changes. So basically accepting the so-called enlargement of Russia's borders, what we called an annexation of 4 regions of Ukraine by Russia, declared last year, as a kind of precondition to talking about the actual freezing of this conflict. And while Russians believe that there is a problem on the western part, about the will actually to continue this conflict, which is partly true because they are piling up of negative consequences of not only of this conflict but also overall global economic situation, which is partly related but partly not to the ongoing war. But actually, that the societies within the Western countries, within the Western world, broadly defined, are not exactly eager, actually, to have this conflict prolonged and paying the possible economic price of that. So on one hand, the Russia has a point in suggesting that there are some weaknesses within the Western part, naming that there are some not much eagerness from the societies, but also from political elites of some, at least, Western countries to have this conflict prolonged quite long. But on the other hand, there are obviously the second part of or the second side of the coin, which is that also the effects of sanctions, Western sanctions on Russia, are piling up. And in a longer term, especially...
You say they're piling up, so we should expect further sanctions still?
No, I mean the effects. So basically... Okay. So there is this effect, delaying effect of some sanctions on the Russian economy, and especially when we look to the fact that the key sanctions addressing the key sources of income for Russian economy, which is energy exports, namely the oil and oil product export, have been only recently introduced in the end of last year and then in February this year. It's only actually start of the effect being visible for the Russian economy and for the Russian budget. And
what would the timescale be for them to really bite?
After a few years of this sanction regime, and especially if there could be expanded somehow, if so-called price cap, for example, could be lowered, that would create even more pressure, financial pressure on the Russian economy. And even now we can see that they are very clearly shrinking revenues for the Russian budget. The prospects for the budget deficit in Russia very much grows. So the effect in the coming years will be bigger for the Russian economy, and the Russians knows that very much. So they understand that actually what they should look for is trying to escalate, to reach this tipping point in relatively short time.
Militarily?
Yes, through military means mostly, but also through the political and psychological effect done by also their narratives. So to use this opportunity before they also feel the rising costs for themselves. So on one hand...
so who is themselves in this case? The government or the people, society?
It is the Russian budget, which transformed mostly towards the society and to a broader elite. Those elements who are key and probably will be last to suffer are the Russian military-industrial complex, because obviously the ongoing war effort is a key for the Kremlin. The Kremlin will be very much focused on have these capabilities actually fully used. And secondly, the narrow circle of people within the Kremlin and around the Kremlin, so the key friends of Vladimir Putin, who actually benefit some changes, also recent changes, also related to assets in Russia. So these elements will be kept as long as possible intact. But those who suffer would be the broader elite and the society of Russia and the other parts of the Russian economy. So there will be a price actually to pay. The longer the war will continue, the bigger will be the dilemma for the Kremlin actually, and the bigger risk will appear, because these costs will rise. And the Kremlin then would have to decide whether to change the priorities, risking the growing tension and the political risks growing, or they should also seek some possible limitation of this conflict, also leading to limiting the immediate costs of this conflict.
How does the Kremlin limit the conflict? Because Ukraine have said they will not negotiate with the current government.
Well, the idea about limiting the conflict, actually, to have the so-called pause in this, is actually is to have a situation in which at least some minimum goals of this operation would be achieved. What are these minimum goals? We can only suspect. Judging from the declarations by the Russians and their narratives, we can assume that especially taking over whole Donbass within the administrative borders of Donetsk region and also Luhansk region, which is basically under the Russian control now, is this key goal. The question is about the Zaporizhia and Kherson regions, who are only partially controlled by the Russians, and also the city of Kherson, who had been lost to Ukrainians at the end of last year. Whether those also regions are really the goal, actually, to retake them, those lands have been lost, retake them by Russia, is the kind of goal which Russia pursues. That's an issue for debate. It may be the case. It, of course, will depend on the level of resistance, level of resilience on the Ukrainian part. But these are certain minimum goals to portray this operation as at least partially successful. So basically to send a message to its own people in Russia that we declared the 4 new regions of Russia as a part of the country, and now we forced Ukrainians actually to de facto at least accept this new reality, and that would be
at least 2 of them.
Yeah. At least 2, but at two plus, obviously, because the Russians still control most of the Kherson and a large part of Zaporizhia regions. But that would be probably this kind of minimum level for Russians to seek some limitation of this conflict. And what is the limitation? Actually, it could happen in 2 ways. One is formal or informal ceasefire, which will basically freeze the conflict, obviously allowing the Russians to recover, and they do need a recovery also in military terms. Or the second way, actually, is to repeat to some extent the previous Donbass ongoing conflict which we witnessed since the 2014. So basically low-level, low-intensity conflict. So actually there will be no ceasefire, formally agreed, but there will be on both sides the limitation of the scale of and intensity of the fighting along the contact line in southeastern Ukraine. So that will be a kind of a pause Russia may seek, but still, again, I would like to underline there are some terms for that. So Russia, for political reasons, Russians are not able to accept the situation that they have not even fulfilled this kind of imagined minimum level of success.
I wanted to ask, would Ukraine or the West make them accept that fact? What is defeat for Russia in Ukraine?
Well, it is also relative, the level of defeat. So first, on the basic level, actually, we are now in a situation of the Russia's defeat in Ukraine. Why? Because obviously Russia has not achieved original goals of this, and we have to kind of return to a beginning, to a genesis of this full-scale invasion. Russia's goal was to control over whole Ukraine. So the idea was to overthrow the government, to install the new puppet government in Ukraine, which will actually put the whole country under de facto Russia's control. And it didn't happen. And even the scale of territorial gains the Russians have had. So the bridgehead, not the bridgehead, but the land corridor towards Crimea, it was mostly secured. But the formal goal of this operation, these goals which had been formally somehow presented, liberation of people of Donbass from the aggression from Ukraine, has not been fulfilled. So because the Russians do not control the whole of Donbass, even this. So that was, and still is, it is a failure. But it seems that from the Russian point of view, from the Kremlin point of view, obviously this failure is still limited because it has not transferred into undermining the key psychological element within the internal situation, namely that there is ongoing conflict and eventually there is hope, which is still there, I mean, in some quarters of the Russian elite at least, that, this is a temporary situation and actually the success will be on Russia's side. What will be the failure in real terms, also creating political risk for the Kremlin, will be the level of defeat in Ukraine, which could not be denied by any narrative, by any propaganda Russia may use. How it could be possible? Probably in a situation when there will be successful Ukrainian offensive in Ukraine, leading to a liberation of most of the Ukrainian territories, which has been up to date occupied by the Russian forces.
Are we talking about the ones occupied in the last year or in the last 8 or 9 years?
And first instance, of course, it's about the post-24 February, but the real a real disaster in political terms would be obviously for Ukraine to cross the previous lines and go deeper into territories held by Russia since 2014, especially Crimea. And Crimea is the psychological issue for the Kremlin, because obviously we have to remember that annexation of Crimea in 2014 was a huge political success and boost for the Kremlin. It has been welcomed by a huge majority of the Russian population, and it created temporary effect because it has lasted up to 4 years. That there has been a quite high-level support for the Kremlin, which was mostly genuine. And a lot of this support actually have been rooted in this geopolitical success which the Kremlin could deliver to its own people. That, look, the historical part of Russia returned to the motherland, Crimea. If Ukraine could basically enter this territory,
even just enter?
Yes, enter, if not to occupy a large part of it, that would mean actually the crossing the past success. That would be a huge blow in political, psychological terms for the Russians, which on one hand would create this high political risk for the Kremlin, but on the other hand, and we have to admit that, it will increase the risk also of real new types of escalation by the Russians. It depends.
The type you mentioned earlier, nuclear escalation.
Even if at the end of that, of course, there is this use of tactical nuclear arms in Ukraine, and here I would like to very much focus on that because that's very important element. So first, Russians perfectly know that this issue is extremely sensitive, and it resonates in the West. So basically, people are afraid of the Third World War. Nuclear war. It's natural. So the important part of the Russian message is actually creating this psychological effect. Look, we are determined. We Russians, we the Kremlin, we are determined. And if we have no other choice, we will use that instrument. And actually, we never know how it may escalate. It may even escalate to kind of global nuclear exchange. This is a kind of nightmare that the Russians would like to present as a natural consequence of the West's involvement in the current war. This is a bluff because Russian leadership perfectly knows that first, to have the proper effect on the battleground, this kind of use of tactical nukes in Ukraine should be massive. Any individual demonstrative use of that actually would not affect Ukrainians in military terms, also in political terms. They would not change the course of the Ukrainian policy. But Russians understand again that there is this sensitiveness of this issue. So what they need from our side is actually to create this psychological effect that we are afraid, we should be afraid of escalation, and because of this, we should be ready for some type of concessions vis-a-vis Russia to avoid this kind of scenario, and especially to pressure Ukraine to limit their level of success and to possibly limit also our support for Ukraine, especially military qualitative support, not to enable Ukrainians to create this kinds of risks. But there is the other side of the coin. So the Russians fully understand that any kind of use of this kind of weapon in the conflict would hugely backlash in political terms globally.
Mm-hmm.
And those countries, such countries like China, India, also others who has been instrumental for the Russian economic survival as Turkey, they all will be strongly against this kind of situation, because everybody knows that there will be a universal effect, namely that some countries who are in possession of nuclear arms, or those countries who potentially may seek capabilities in nuclear sphere, would be highly boosted actually to reach whether to use a nuclear blackmail or actual use of tactical nukes, or actually to achieve nuclear capabilities in order to use that as a strong instrument in their policies. So it would destabilize hugely global situation, global security, but also security in the individual regions. Russians perfectly know that there is this opposition, this resistance against such a situation from the part of the key countries, politically and economically key for Russia, actually to sustain. So Russian leadership would be very, very careful actually to use that instrument and use it only as a last resort. And here we come to the last element, actually, what could be in reality the moment in which the Kremlin, Putin himself, could really consider using this type of instrument. Again, this is only a speculation, but understanding the logic of the system and also kind of psychological situation of these people, we may suspect that they will be willing to do that only in extreme scenario in which there will be a direct and immediate threat to a regime survival in Russia. So basically, if they see
from within,
yes, if they see that the scale of the disaster in Ukraine war is creating an internal backlash within Russia, which immediately threatens their survival as a regime, and only in such kind of absolutely extreme scenario, which by far is not the most probable at this stage. We still cannot see that happening, and only in that kind of radical scenario they may be really tempted to use that instrument. But I would like to make also a small footnote to that, because we are all talking about kind of extreme scenarios, but obviously there are also some elements of Russia's behavior which are below of this threshold of military use of nuclear weapons in the conflict, which are, for example, an open deployment of nuclear arms into a neighboring areas, namely Belarus or Kaliningrad region of Russia, which actually is a tricky thing, because in Kaliningrad we suppose there are tactical nukes already there. But the Russians do not admit that in public, but they could change that policy. Again, there is another element, which is a nuclear test. The Russians may make a nuclear test on their own territory. They have still the old testing
But
grounds
this
ready.
would come under the category of saber rattling.
Yes, but a kind of escalation of that, it's quite serious element of escalation. An actual signal they could be ready for that actually was present during the speech of Putin, which we talked about. Putin instructed the Ministry of Defense for actual preparation for doing a nuclear test by Russia in the event that the American side would decide to do such tests themselves as a part of their process of modernization of the nuclear arsenal of the U.S. Of course, it's a bullshit in a sense that Russia knows that actually it is not fully necessary at this stage, at least, to have these tests by the U.S., but by signaling actually their readiness to do their own tests, they sending the signal, yes, we are actually prepared for that. We are preparing the test. So the signal is already there. So they are actually preparing the psychological and political grounds for doing this.
Okay, so thank you, Marek, very much for shedding a lot of light onto some very dark corners. We didn't really look very much into the West's possible responses to this. Would you be able to come back and talk about that in another interview?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. So thank you very much again.
Thank you.
You have been watching or listening to an OSW podcast. If you enjoyed the content, please like it. And if you're interested in the second part of this interview, please subscribe to our channel.